I see it says live.
I'll send you the link now once I have it. Done. Redirecting to YouTube. There we go. It's that simple. Okay, now what I need to do is mute this because otherwise I hear myself twice. Okay, so it's working. Right. So I've sent the link in the WhatsApp. I'll also put it in the chat in case you want to see it. But don't have the volume on your YouTube feed, otherwise you'll get very confused. It's bizarre. It's like you hear yourself talking from something a moment ago. It's like completely confusing. Okay. So let's just check with Carl that he's got it. Seems to be working fine. Oh, shit. Sorry, I did it in the wrong chat here. I sent it to the Muizenberg Community Notice Board instead. So we can have a whole lot of strange people from Muizenberg tuning in.
I'll be right back, just quickly grabbing something.
Guys, my sinuses are acting up, so sometimes I'll probably get off video or something. Don't mind me, I'm just blowing my nose.
All right.
Okay.
Wrong instrument. Not bad for a 56-year-old, hey, Carl? Hey.
I'm Mandy.
It's bizarre watching myself on YouTube. These glasses are no good. They're going to come off. Not much of an improvement.
Oh, I see.
By the way, I'm able to spotlight a speaker. So, for example, where am I now? So, for example, the way it works is, here we go. So, for example, I can spotlight you. So, for example, there. Now, I think you're the spotlight. Is that right? Carl will confirm by WhatsApp in a moment when he gets it that you are at Chamas is spotlighted.
How do we?
Then I can unspotlight. So depending on who's talking, I can spotlight them.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Right. I can
Can I
also
just
make you
check
host.
my screen if it's gonna share?
I see. Yeah.
Yes. You can share your screen. Go ahead.
It should be sharing now.
Let me see. Hold on.
I see your shared screen.
Yes, it's working.
Okay, perfect.
It's fine. Then what I don't know if I can. Yeah, okay, fine.
It's fine. No, I'll reshare it when it's time for me to speak.
Okay, cool. Yes, Carl's his message to say that, yeah, so when someone's speaking for their 10 minutes, I will spotlight them, yes. Because otherwise it's microphone sensitive. Everyone else should be muted when the other person's talking, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, good. Well, we're live in 7.
In 7. All right.
You found
No,
such
gallery view
like
best for
Chiamu.
I'm gonna show you. I'm in front of a window. That's why good lighting.
a view from my window. There's a Facebook group called A View from My Window. I
Oh,
don't know if
wow.
you've seen it. It's like big. It's basically for lockdown around the world, and people have been sending pictures from their various views. Some particularly amazing views. Okay, I'm looking at the YouTube and not at the. Which one am I looking at now? See, I can't even tell. Okay. Yep. Okay, so wait, when we go live, it's straight to you, right, Chama?
Okay. Just give me a countdown so I know that I am live.
Well, you're live now. In fact, anyone who gets the link, knows and see this. Anyone who gets the link can see this.
When we start having participants.
Or we can have a countdown, which is in 4 minutes.
Yeah.
So that everybody knows to be on their best.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Let me go to, I'll go to Access's phone and try to retweet.
Now, there are 3 people watching now.
Okay, that's good.
Which I think is me and Carl and one of you.
Yes,
No.
it's me. Because I want it to be, because like on my phone, I can't see everybody at the same time. So if I video on YouTube, then I can see the hands and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, put all your phones on silent, because every time somebody's phone gets a message, I think it's me that's getting a message.
I think also using like WhatsApp or something on your laptop, just switch off the notification sounds, because if everything your audio, so go on WhatsApp.
Yeah. Hi, Lishiba. One of my friends is online and can see us.
How can you tell?
He
Comment
just,
in the.
No, he just WhatsApped. He says he's
Oh,
watching.
WhatsApp. Okay.
Yeah, we started
with 3
one.
people.
Yeah.
Oh, there's 5 now. Can people comment here? They can, right? Add a public comment. And I'm also assuming that this is being recorded because the video gets kept, I believe.
If as the host, you were supposed to record.
No, I know, but when you stream on YouTube, I did this last time, right, Carl? What happens is YouTube records the video.
Oh,
and then you can edit the video. Yeah, I did this for another event. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, send the link, Carl.
Yes, I've already sent link to some people. I see somebody that I know that just joined. Okay, let me just.
But we'll start at like 1 minute past there. Give everyone a chance to hook in. Carl says Neville is correct. YouTube does auto save. Good. I'm going to send this link to our folks at DST and NRF. Andrew Kaniki, Jonathan Dietrichs, Saletti, Luma. Getting another call here, just a second, folks. I'm fine, and you? Yes. Yes. Okay, so it's 12:59. We'll go live in a few moments.
Okay. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes.
Okay, she's all yours. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a lockdown panel discussion hosted by Access. My name is Tiama Molele. I am a master's student at the University of the Western Cape. So the Habits for Planet Lockdown Live is a series of online panel discussions in which Planeteers are going to discuss topics that are interested to the current global pandemic. All these sessions are going, we are live streaming them. As you can see, you can find it on YouTube. There's a link on Facebook that you can use so that we can all enjoy a safe distance while still enjoying the things that we like and also learning and interacting from each other. The scientists that we'll be talking to are Hpw alumni and thinkers. So this is an exciting discussion. And then the panel will give their opinions on the topic at hand, which is life after COVID-19. How will South Africa be different in the new normal? I suggest that you go onto our Access Facebook page if you have any questions that you would like to give our panelists. I would like to start to introduce our first panelist, which is Dr. Ubani Kambela. He is a senior lecturer, anthropologist, and an award-winning educator at the University of the Western Cape, at the University of Johannesburg. He teaches on medical anthropology, anthropological theory, and childhood and youth. He's currently working on a monograph on the anthropology of boyhoods, with Duke University Press. He has been a Planeteer since all the way from 2010 HPW 8, and he's a former core lecturer, and he's also a member of the steering committee. Would you like to say hi to everybody?
Hi, everyone.
Our next panelist is Mendy Shozi. She's a research assistant at the Pollution Research Group, which is based at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Howard College. She participated in the first version of HPW in 2014, and then she attended HPW 16 in Cape Town. As a core lecturer, she attended training in 2015, and then she again lectured at KwaZulu-Natal in HPW 17. Professionally, she's an environmental scientist, and she works in the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector. Mandy, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi, everyone. Sorry about the noise in the background. My son doesn't quite understand what a live meeting is.
Hi, no worries. Our last panelist is Alex Lenferner. He's also a former Planeteer. He actually was on the same Planeteer as Dr. Kobani. He is a Fulbright and Mandela Rhodes Scholar. He has a PhD in philosophy, which focuses on climate justice from the University of Washington. He serves as a South African climate justice campaigner with 350africa.org. He's also a secretary of the Climate Justice Coalition. Alex is also of organizing one of the HPW's HPW 12. Do you want to say hi to everybody, Alex?
Everybody, Sanbrani, nice to chat to you.
So before we get into the speakers, I also would like to introduce to you the director of Access, Dr. Neville Strait. Would you like to say hi to everybody, Dr. Neville?
Hello, everybody from Cape Town, from a very cold and rainy and wintry Cape Town. Nice to be here. Great that you've put this event on. Thanks for everybody who's participating. And I will be behind the scenes pushing the button and airing my opinions as I usually do when I have the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So without further ado, we'll start with Dr. Kobani.
Right. Thank you very much, Chiamo. Let me just share my screen. Sorry. Okay. Is my screen sharing now? Okay, fantastic. So as Chiamo has said, my name is Kobani and I'm a former Planeteer. For my brief, I've decided to speak about inequalities, pandemics, and to start thinking about what the post-COVID-19 South Africa would look like. But just to begin with, I just want to emphasize that there's not enough time to really cover the scope of the issues that the pandemic has really brought up. So I've really decided to focus really on two primary issues that I think have a linkage to what I've learned from HPW and the current moment that we're in, and what I would hope the post-COVID moment would look like. So just to give a little brief introduction, as Chama has said already, I'm a former Planeteer. I attended the 2010 Habitable Planet Workshop with Dr. Landberger. It was actually right after the World Cup, so it was quite an interesting time in South Africa. But like I've had various other engagements as well as a co-lecturer, steering committee member, and so on. And so really my entry into Access is I'm not a scientist and I don't have training in science. I majored in politics, law, and anthropology. So really my key entry point was really as a social scientist, and it was really informed as well by my own background, growing up in rural Eastern Cape in Ladyfrere, and some of the challenges we've faced, particularly around depleting water resources in the area. So I was really, when I applied, I was really interested in what could I as a social scientist contribute to that particular moment and the creation of habitable and sustainable conditions on planet Earth. So one of the key starting point for me that I also think is so important at this moment is that these issues are so big that they cannot just be left to scientists alone, and that we and what the environmental issues are also not separate from the social issues that we face in South Africa. And this ties to the 2 points that I really want to think about in terms of the current moment we're in with COVID-19 and what I would hope for the post-COVID world, post-COVID South Africa. And really it's the issues of poverty, and I use poverty and inequality together, and issues of structural exclusion and inaccess to resources. And when I was preparing this, I thought about our trip that we took, Alex might remember, to Hamburg. And we learned about the story of Mam Nozet. Mam Nozet was this amazing woman in Hamburg, and she spoke about her experiences as a former abalone poacher in the area. And she talked about some of these structural issues, the poverty she was facing, that it was forcing them to engage in these illegal activities because of the need to support the family. But part of this, there was this tension, because she says, as you can see there, that, you know, that people do actually want nature and they don't want degradation, but these kinds of structural issues around poverty, inequalities, and so on put people in positions where they often have to take some actions that might be anti the environment, but also might be illegal in certain instances. So I wanted to relate this narrative by Mam Nozet to thinking about health, because I am a medical anthropologist. And really what we're interested in medical anthropology is really that we understand your health is really influenced by your social environment. So when you think about, for instance, going to a biomedical doctor, the doctor will likely most of the time look at what is happening physiologically that is making you sick. And we say that's important and that has its own place, but we should also look at the social. So when you think about TB, for instance, you can't talk about TB without looking at the kinds of transportation that people use, the kinds of housing conditions that they have, the kinds of diet and so on. So we say that the social also plays a huge role in well-being. And so we are really interested in uprooting these social roots of illness. So it's not just what is happening physiologically in the body that is making you sick, but also what happens externally, socially, in the social context that puts people at risk of infection. So one of the key starting points that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of COVID-19 is really what we often call the social determinants of health in medical anthropology and in public health as well. And it's really the idea that your health is determined socially. So it's not that, you know, the physiology or the genetics don't play a role, but also other factors. So your behavior, think about COVID, do you wear a mask, don't you wear a mask? Your environment, access to medical care, social factors, all of these are really important in thinking about what makes people sick. So we don't just look at one thing, we look at the individual, social structures, the environment, and other species. Some people have called this the concept of one health, which is, you know, if the environment is not healthy, then the individual is affected, other species are affected as well in this one health, because we are all in it together. So in thinking about Mam Nozet's experiences, especially with poverty and inequality, access or inaccess and structural exclusion, I went back to this article by Professor Stephen Friedman. And one of the key things that he is arguing in that article is that, you know, we know that pandemics don't necessarily create inequalities, but they do reveal them. And he was writing about how, you know, this pandemic has really brought to the fore and has really revealed in many ways our divisions in South Africa, not just racially, but in terms of class, in terms of gender, and many, many other factors. So, and also what we know in South Africa is that, you know, poverty and inequality are deeply racialized. And we know that the government hasn't really given us the statistics of vulnerability to COVID. But we know, I think it was just last week from the tweet that I shared where the ministers were saying, even though they haven't released the stats, we do know that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the health outcomes primarily of Black population in South Africa. But it's not just about race, but it's also about your class position. So we know that it's not just the racial aspect, but that we know that often pandemics affect the poorest of the poorest the hardest. So in terms of job losses, the loss of income and various other factors. So, and I mean, this is not new. When you look at a lot of the writings around social inequality and pandemics, we know that, that they do in many ways often reflect prevailing social inequalities. So we know that people who live in crowded conditions, people with the so-called underlying health conditions, or people prone to diabetes, and so on, and people who often don't have accessible healthcare services are often the hardest hit, and South Africa has not been very different to that. And so what we actually see revealed in this pandemic is really the issue of structural violence. And structural violence is really this idea that, people are not just killed when I take a knife and I stab you, I take a gun and I shoot you, but that there are social structures in society that are created. They can include law, the economic systems, and many, many other factors. And that by these factors, people are often prone in various ways to illness. And so we can also see, again, with education in South Africa, when you think about, for instance, private schools have been in many ways able to continue with the education programs, but we know that for young people who go to rural and peri-urban township schools, that there's been this divide. In many ways, learning has been halted. We know that already in South Africa, we have such a high unemployment rate, and we know that now with people losing jobs and so many sectors closing, that this does continue to perpetuate structural violence and economic inequalities. So when I think about what this moment has meant for me is to really think, I think the post-COVID world, we have to really think about how do we really eliminate the social inequalities, because we've also seen the ways in which this pandemic has revealed challenges around policing in South Africa, the force of the South African police state. When you think about gender-based violence, I mean, in just 1 week of lockdown, I think the Minister of Police was saying over 80,000 cases were logged of forms of gender-based violence. And so just before I close, I mean, there was this report in 2016 that was published by the World Bank, and they said, 3 of the most serious threats to human life that threaten human life and economic security is the issue of climate change, conflicts, and pandemics. And so one of the things that I'm learning and to start thinking about how we move forward, and I hope we can discuss post-COVID, is how do we address these economic and structural and issues of structural violence that we've seen come up as a result of the pandemic. So I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khubani. Mandy, you're next. Are you ready? The floor is yours.
Yes. Hi, everyone. As Chiama has already said, I've been involved in Access since 2014. Professionally, I studied chemistry and environmental science in my postgrad, and work-wise, I've worked in the environmental impact assessment field, and then I've moved into water, sanitation, and hygiene since 2015, and that's where I primarily work in now. Based at UKZN in the Pollution Research Group, where we undertake sustainably work that has got to do with improved sanitation technologies and how we deal with fecal sludge and waste. For me, in terms of COVID-19, because of my field, I'd like to stick primarily to looking at SDG 6, which states that they're trying to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And this is all to be done by 2030 nationally. But just to look primarily in South Africa, when you take a look at that essay, the report that was released in 2019, it's available for everyone to download online. We can see that South Africa has, over the years, been trying to improve water supply, the infrastructure, access to basic and improved sanitation to South Africans. But there is a long way to go. And we can see from everything that's been happening with COVID-19 and those that have been lacking the sanitation, clean water to be able to wash their hands as they have been regulated, is not possible, and it's very disproportional as to what Dr. Khubani has said before me. there is this inequality when it comes to not just races, but to classes as well. And just when you look at SDG 6, indicator 6.1.1 talks about the proportion of population using safely managed water services. So that's just got to do with the infrastructure that they have. And not just that, but is it safely managed? With the pandemic we have right now, that's an important question. In 2017 alone, 95% of the population had access to water supply infrastructure. As to whether it was safely managed, it was less percent at 80%. So those are some of the things you have to look at in order to curb the spread of the virus. When you look at indicator 6.2.1, it speaks of the proportion of the population using safely managed sanitation services. So these not just flush toilets, so these can be ventilated improved pits or VIP latrines that are closed. So we're not talking about open defecation or any buildings that don't have a door or a toilet seat. So we're talking about ones that have been improved and offer a single family home, not just those sharing like a community ablution block. So for that, in 2017, 83% of the national population had access to improved sanitation facilities. And that's just 2017. So obviously we have some ways to go, and just to track what's been happening in the past 2 years and how in 2020 with COVID-19 that has been impacted, especially with all the programs and all the rolling out of housing and improved sanitation and water supply in most areas by the minister. I'm sure we can see an improvement in these stats, but that needs to be maintained as well. And just to note that South Africa only started tracking the level of hygiene in 2019. So with those stats, it's still, we still don't have enough to be able to say, which is actually one of the things that has been noted in research, that when you're talking about the wash sector, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene seems to take a back seat when it comes to that field. So that's with COVID-19, that has obviously come up more to realize that we don't have to look at just supplying them with water, or we just supplying them with basic sanitation services, but how is it managed? Is there any spread of any other viruses or illnesses or diseases, not just COVID-19? So that's one of the major things. And what I like about where I'm working right now is that we have been assisting technology developers around the world in testing their improved sanitation facilities. So this can be front end, which would be like a toilet seat. It may use little to no water, and by no water, it could be recycled water from the flushing, and hand washing facilities that use the recycled water, and to back-end systems, that's where they treat the excreta that comes out. So it can be the urine and the feces, and then seeing those waste streams as potential resources to be used for other uses, such as agriculture. So yeah, it's been quite an interesting time, yeah, especially in research, and to know that what you're actually doing in the labs and schools, how can it be implemented, and what can you do now to make sure that your research and the work that you're doing has an impact going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mindy. And our last speaker, Dr. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tiamo. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be chatting to you today. So my name's Alex, and I think a lot of people kind of asked the question of me, because I studied philosophy, kind of what role does my voice have in these climate change discussions? Because obviously Access is very focused on climate change. I think a lot of people see climate change as a scientific issue, right? So they wonder, what role does somebody who's trained in philosophy have in discussions around climate change? And I'm glad that I get to follow after Mendy and Tobani, because I think what they've really highlighted is that the way that issues like climate change, the way that issues like water access and pandemics, the way that they play out is very much characterized by deep inequalities in terms of who it impacts. And when it comes to climate change as well, it's very much deep inequalities in terms of who causes the problem, right? So we think about those that are most responsible for driving the climate change problem. We know that it is typically the richer, wealthier global north and whiter countries and communities that are most responsible for driving the crisis. And typically those that are on the receiving end of these injustices, of the climate impacts, are poorer, low income, blacker, browner communities, often in rural areas, but just more generally too. So there's those deep inequalities at the heart of the climate change issue. And so where philosophy comes in is we think about questions of ethics and justice, which are central to this. How we respond to climate change is a question of justice because of those inequalities, because of thinking about what is the fair way to respond to this crisis that's characterized by deep inequality and deep unfairness, right? So that's really where philosophy comes in to a significant extent. And so kind of what we face now with COVID-19 is kind of like a multiplier of those injustices in a way. And I think Kobani really outlined that in a really strong way. And climate change itself is also called like a threat multiplier because it often tends to deepen and further injustices that were already present, right? And it tends to widen those quite significantly. And in the South African context, COVID-19 really is speeding up a lot of those in a way, not just because of the pandemic itself, but also because of the economic impacts of response measures. What we're seeing across the world really is a deep economic recession facing so many countries. And in the South African context, that's even more profound because we already were entering into recession and now we've got it even deeper, right? And so in this context of deep, deep inequality, of deep poverty, right, of deep unemployment, incredible unemployment levels, how do we come back and recover from COVID-19, right? There's a lot of good economic evidence that shows that one of the really key ways that we need to respond is through stimulus and recovery packages led by the government. They have to be investing in helping people out. Otherwise, people are falling through the cracks all across our country. Deep questions of hunger, deep questions of water access that really are pressing right now. So given that we need to implement some sort of stimulus and recovery program, the question becomes, what do we want to stimulate? What do we want to recover? Where do we want to invest that, right? Because stimulus programs can be targeted. They can help grow certain sectors. They can help grow others, right? It's a question of government policy. It's a question of ethics and justice, which sectors we want to grow, right? So we can ask ourselves questions such as, do we want to encourage more jobs? Do we want to reduce pollution? Do we want to ensure better water access? Do we want to ensure sustainable and inclusive economic growth through these recovery programs, which we will desperately need, right? And if we want positives on all that, the studies show quite clearly that renewable energy is one of the most vital ways to bring a lot of those positives through. So studies show that renewable energy can reduce how much water we're using. There was one study that showed that if we moved to renewable energy instead of coal, we could save 196 billion liters of water. That's a huge water saving, right? In a country that is in the middle of a national drought disaster declaration, right? So that's a vital saving. It can also create more jobs compared to fossil fuels. If we stayed with coal, for example, it could create up to 200,000 more jobs by 2030 and 1 million by 2050. And if we did a broader transformation beyond renewable energy, we can really stimulate major job creation, right? And at the same time, it can give us cheaper energy by a quarter on some estimates because renewable energy is now the cheapest. And it can also ensure more sustainable, inclusive economic growth, right? But I think within the sort of the climate change sphere, there's often this focus of, yeah, we transition to renewable energy, but there isn't a question of like, what does that transition look like? Because you can have a just transition or you can have just a transition, right? So we want to make sure that transition is just. And so what does justice mean in this context, especially in this context of deep inequality, right? And unemployment. I think the first thing it must mean is taking care of those that are dependent on coal if we make that transition to renewable energy. So coal-dependent communities and workers need to be invested in. They need alternative livelihood opportunities. Otherwise, we will leave them behind. And we saw this when the gold mining sector went through deep crisis and began shutting down is that communities were left destitute, and we can't make the same mistake when it comes to moving to renewable energy. But I think there's also a question of a much broader, deeper transformation that needs to occur. And this is where civil society coalitions like the Climate Justice Coalition that I'm secretary for, but also the group called the Cry of the Excluded, which is made up of trade unions and civil society coming together, is calling for something much deeper. It's not just about tweaking our energy systems on the margins. It's about recognizing the need for a much broader transformation of our society that sees climate justice as part of connection to social justice and racial justice and gender justice, which are all tied into a pretty extractive system that exploits both people and the planet, right? And so how do we think about this in a more systemic way that puts climate change not as this isolated issue, but as a symptom of a deeper extractive system, right? And how do we then put solutions that recognize it as such rather than as an isolated issue? And so we have groups like that Cry of the Excluded calling for something called a radical Green New Deal, which is about really transforming our societies and putting people to work, potentially millions of jobs in redefining and rebuilding our society in a better way. And there was a really good research paper that came out from a group called the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, which is a pretty important think tank that often influences government thinking, about the role of renewable energy within that being pretty vital in providing benefits like inclusive growth, like industrial development and sustainable energy systems. And so it's clear that we can benefit both the climate, but also our broader economy and put more people to work if we begin this transition, right? And we use the fact that we need to now invest significantly in our economy to invest in the sorts of economic systems and the sorts of energies that can build a better future. Because the bottom line is, before COVID-19 hit, the climate crisis was dire and urgent. The scientists were telling us we needed to be reducing emissions at an unprecedented scale. And so the question as we think about how do we recover and what sort of stimulus packages we have is not, do we go back to business as usual? We know business as usual, normal was not working. It wasn't working for the climate, but it wasn't working for the vast majority of South Africans who are living in poverty, living in deep unemployment. And so I think there's going to be a lot of people that are trying to, or a lot of maybe more regressive forces that are going to try use the stimulus package or this moment to try bail out the coal or to try get us back to business as usual. But really, I think the question we face is, can we use this moment where we really need to be investing in society to invest in a society that works for the many, not the few, that works to address environmental justice, and that really brings people into an inclusive form of growth that puts human health and well-being and job creation at the forefront, and not just a lopsided form of deeply unequal growth, which has characterized South Africa for so long. And so I think COVID-19, in a sense, provides an opportunity to make a change. And the question of whether we will make a change, I think very much still depends on what civil society, on what government's response will be. So I think the future is still to be written. And part of our work in civil society is to push for a very different vision of the future that works better. And I think it's part of us, especially as young people, to raise our voices to ensure that whatever recovery program we have doesn't push us into another crisis, even worse crisis in the future. So we can't fix one crisis by inflaming another, essentially. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tiama, you're on mute, I think. There we are.
Yeah. Now, thank you so much, Alex. So this draws to a close in terms of the panels speaking. And I feel like one thing that is very evident is that there's a lot of inequalities. That's one thing that I took out from all three of those talks, is that inequality is the central issue in this conversation, and how life after COVID will be in terms of a new normal. I think we need to like also scrap the whole new normal, because like as Alex mentioned, is like the normal we had was not working. So I think it is now like a perfect time for me to now go to the question section and just I know before the event started, there were a lot of people that posted their questions, and if you still have a question, please feel free to post on the comment sections on Facebook and on YouTube, and then I will make sure that our panelists answer them. So I will just move right into the questions. So we've got a first question. The first question is from an HPW alumni, I believe. It is Hammond Moti. And I need to apologize for all the misspelling and mispronunciation of everybody's names. I am not a monster. I am not a master. So basically he said, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. While this pandemic has unmasked the social inequality differences between the rich and the poor, between the less and the most vulnerable groups, with now most vulnerable groups having bigger consequences during and after the pandemic. This may be due to how the group has been neglected or probably abandoned by the government in improving both their social and economic statuses. For instances, schools are resuming, but some schools are not because they do not have the adequate water, and some do not have toilets. Also, we've seen how difficult this group is suffering and assessing better health services during the pandemic. So, Hammond's question is, what do you think the government should handle this issue post-pandemic? Most the vulnerable group in improving both the social and economic status to avoid suffering in crises like these. The question over to you, Dr. Obani.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. I didn't catch the name of the person, but thank you, Chiamo, for reading that. And I think, you know, both Mendy and certainly Dr. Alex have touched on this, which is really that, you know, the government has to play a central role in this, because a lot of these are systemic issues. And so you can't really, there was a tweet I saw a few days ago, it was someone who was like, you can't excellence yourself outside of structural violence or structural exclusion. So really the first starting point is to really understand this as a systemic issue, and that whilst of course an individual can play a role, but a lot of this has to come from the people who create these structures. When you think about housing, when you think about gender, you think about schooling system, you think about Mendy's work on hygiene. All of these are centered around the government correcting. There's no amount that an individual has unless you are you are George Bezos, the richest billionaire. I forgot his name. So I think the key starting point would be to really recognize that power that the government has to actually do more for addressing these systemic issues. There was also, I can't remember who said it, but someone was saying that, you know, we've been hearing a lot about existing preconditions in this COVID era. And this person was saying inequality itself is a pre-existing condition. That's why it literally makes people sick in different ways. So we can't address any of these without, as Dr. Alex has touched upon, really the government taking a lead in creating these stimuluses to be able for people to be able to respond. I don't want to take too much time, so I will hand over to other people.
Thank you so much. You are actually so right. I think, but then I think one thing that is also an issue is like, I mean, I'm going to be a devil's advocate here because of how the government is. As a youth, I've seen how the government has gone through, done a lot of things. And I mean, recently we just saw that shipment going to a school disappeared. So how would can I, as a citizen, trust the government to ensure that these inequalities are made? Because it's clear that as they've been in power for the amount that they've been, and these inequalities are still there, we're still having the same conversations that we're having 10 years ago. So as a citizen, can I trust?
Yeah, I'm actually gonna put Dr. Alex on the spot because he works in the activist arena. I'm in the academy, but I think someone like him would actually have interesting reflections on how do we actually, as young people, even within the limitations of structural and economic violence, how do we exercise our agency in ways that keep the government accountable? And I think someone like him in that sphere would have more useful reflections. So I'm respectfully handing the question over.
I see I've been put on the spotlight too here. Thanks, Dr. Kawani. I'm still used to being called Dr. Alex, but but to speak to the question, I think it's a pervasive problem that is still with us and is in some ways has deepened significantly over the last 10 years. And what we find in South African society is, trade unions are at some of their weakest points. Civil society is at one of their weaker points in terms of holding the government accountable. And so part of what we need to be thinking about in terms of how do we hold government accountable is how do we build much stronger trade union movements who have traditionally played a vital role in holding the government to task, but also broader civil society coalitions that can really put meaningful pressure on the government. And I think we must also speak to the woeful nature of a lot of our opposition parties that really, I'm not inspired by any, if I'm being honest. So there really needs to be a broader reckoning with our political class and whose interests they represent. And I don't think we can wait for the political class to answer this for us, right? Because the political class has their own interests and they are often entwined with powerful political structures and the elite. Even those that like to talk about radical economic transformation, especially in the energy sector, are deeply embedded with like private coal interests and are corrupt, right? So corruption goes through the core. Even if people are talking left and radical, it's often, it's a smokescreen for broader interests, right? And so how do we build those coalitions? And especially young people. Young people have been at the core of really shaking up society. And I think we're starting to see the stirrings of that in South Africa. I mean, it happened with the Flawless movement, and it is happening in the climate change movement too, where young people are fed up. And so we need to build on that. And I think we need to get radical, quite honest, because the problems we face are radical problems. And so they require radical solutions and really strong political developments to ensure that we can have them. So yeah, we need to learn to work together, and which is hard in a country of deep inequality and the sort of problematic legacies we have, especially around race, which are still very much with us. But how do we build coalitions across that, but that also coalitions that really speak to the interests of the poor and the working class too, central. I'll leave it there. I don't want to go on too long.
Thank you. Yeah, it's evident that this particular question is not something that really can be answered at one go. There's like a lot. It's bigger. It's a mouthful in fact. And speaking about like systems in place, Mandy mentioned in her talk about technological implementations that her where she's working, the type of technologies that they're working with. I'm just interested to know, these technologies, are they being implemented in South Africa, or is it just something that is just happening abroad?
For now, we are doing testing. We're at the testing phase, and through testing, that's when you're able to have a real world or real environment feel of how your machine that was in the lab, your technology that was in the lab, how will it actually work in the field? And some of the technologies, maybe they were manufactured or for use in the US or in India, where they don't use toilet paper. And so when you come to kind of test it here in South Africa, where we do use toilet paper, you kind of run into some of these problems. So for now, it's just testing. In terms of implementation, that's something that once they get the results and data that they need, the technology developers, then they themselves take it through the commercialization and manufacturing phase. We just involved only in testing.
So going back to COVID-19, there was a question for you, Mandy, from Chusta. I'll just leave it at that. Chusta asked, should South African government, okay, let me just read it out nicely. They asked, basically they said they're so excited and they have a question for you. The question is that in terms of like, I lost it right now for a second. Just give me a second. Okay, it says, should South African government just fund South African people, or should they fund everybody that is in South Africa facing this pandemic as we speak?
Depends what they mean by funding.
Like
if they're talking in, yeah,
relief,
sorry.
They mean in terms of relief methods, stimulus packages, and so on.
This is beyond my field. Can I pass this on to Tobani? I think he knows more of this, yeah.
Yes, Tobani can answer that.
Okay, let me hear if I got the question right. So in terms of stimulus for instance, COVID response, you are saying, should it be just for our South Africans, or should they be like, funding?
No, you don't have a South African ID. Are you? Yeah. Basically, that's what they're asking.
Well, I mean, if I remember from, undergraduate law, anyone who is in South Africa is covered by the South African Constitution. So we can't just say because someone is here, then they can access healthcare, they can access certain services. There are, of course, issues around legality and how you got here. So I think that's very clear. Like whoever in South Africa has constitutional rights and is protected in various forms. When you think about in terms of, which is, I think, the other part to the question, when you think about South Africa, for instance, funding other countries, that gets a little bit more complicated. I mean, one of the things that I think I read an article actually, and I was thinking about it so much when Dr. Alex was presenting, which was saying, if we don't learn from COVID, this is in some ways a preview of what's going to happen with the climate crisis. And one of the key things that this author was saying is one of the things that what pandemics show is how interconnected we are in so many different ways. It shows that, a failing healthcare system in one area will result in also failures in another part. And it's the same with the economy and so on. So I wouldn't be too nationalistic in my response about it. I think one of the things it shows, and again, Dr. Alex touched on it, which is the need for more alliances and for more collaboration. And I think those would need to go across countries. We've seen in South Africa, other countries sending, Cuba sending doctors to South Africa, the US sending PPE. We've also contributed to other Southern African contexts. So I wouldn't be too restricted. I think one of the things that I think we should come away with here is in some ways how intricately linked so many of our destinies are. And you can just imagine if it's like this with a pandemic, what is it gonna be like with climate destruction and our ability to respond as citizens. So I would say, of course, if South African government, I always believe we should, of course, clean your own house first. But if we have resources, we have absolutely nothing to lose from supporting other countries and building with them. So yes. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So there's a question by somebody that is watching on YouTube. It is by Hpw Event. It is for Mandy. Mandy, you touched on a very important issue that affects the wash sector. But how can hygiene progress be improved, seeing that this is a global issue?
Thank you, Hpw, for that question. In terms of hygiene, it's kind of a tough one because we haven't, as a country, you haven't quite been focused on looking at hygiene. We've always been so focused on, can we supply this community with water? Yes, and check the box. Have we given them toilets? Yes, check the box. In terms of the maintenance after that, how exactly are you protecting kids from playing in dirty sewer water, if pipes burst or anything like that? Have you supplied a place for them to wash their hands? Is there soap there? All those things aren't quite on the pedestal of just water and sanitation. There are community pollution blocks around Durban. They are monitored and managed by Hpw municipality. And there they have people that actually take care of the blocks where it's a communal. So for a certain number of households, they'll use one block, maybe that they will have 4 or 5 toilets, some showers, and some facilities to be able to wash your laundry outside. So for there, I think with that one, because they get supplied toilet paper as well, it's flushing toilets that into sewer. There's some improvement in the hygiene there. Although when it comes to if there's some blockages or suddenly a pipe bursts and no one from the municipality can get there quickly, there's obviously some concerns with how it's hygiene managed there. And in places where there isn't any pipes or piped water or any sewage, that's when you need to kind of the work that we do, looking at these other sanitation technologies. What can you put there in place to make sure that people are able to wash their hands? People are able to stay clean and not be able to spread any infections, especially in dense informal settlements. So that's a big one. How can you implement not just water and sanitation, but hygiene facilities in very densely placed places where in South Africa or European context, we all want flushing toilets in our households, but it's not always possible. So it's just a matter of South Africa and the world having the social change of you don't have to have a flushing toilet, but what can you have that is dignified, that you can use, that works in the South African context?
Thank you. I hope Hpw, your question has been answered nicely. So what I want us to move on to is to the climate aspect of this. So I'm going to ask Alex this next question. It is by me actually. So since the lockdown started, so we've all noticed that the cars are parked, the flights are standstill. So, and then as a result, we obviously can see that we've seen on social media people posting pictures of clearer skies, and there's a clear reduction in CO2 emission. So my question is, do you think this 2 months of zero emission has had like a significance in the long run of us fighting climate change?
Thanks, Tiamo. I think it's a really important question. The short answer is yes and no, and a big no as well. I want to sort of paint a metaphor to explain why. So what we have seen is emissions, the rate of emissions has reduced, but you can kind of think of it like a bath that's overflowing, right? And we've got the tap like spewing out a lot of water, and the water is carbon emissions for the sake of the metaphor, right? And so what essentially we've done is this bath is overflowing because we already have more carbon emissions in the atmosphere than is safe, right? So our bath is already overflowing. And what happened during the lockdown is that we've closed the tap a little bit. So it's flowing out less fast, but we're still overflowing the bath, right? And it's still coming out. And what we need to get to, what the scientists tell us we need to do, well, of different scientists, but what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, says we need to do, is get to net zero by 2050, if not well before, because we're overflowing that bath faster than they hope we would. So we need to basically shut that tap and stop emitting emissions, or emit as few as possible, and then start bailing out the water that's there. And so pulling our carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. So we've slowed that tap a little bit. That's a good thing, right? But we need to slow it much faster and eventually, and shut it very quickly. And so the task ahead of us is to do much more. And the thing is, we don't have to rely on a pandemic to reduce emissions, or a recession, or a war. We shouldn't. That's not what we want to hope for when it comes to climate change. If we really take a proper, strong, government-led, every actor involved approach to climate change, we can help address poverty. We can help ensure better, more inclusive economic growth. So we can take climate action while also addressing our sustainable development goals and creating a better future. So this drop in emissions is okay, and it's some small bit of good news, but we need to be doing much more. We need to be centering justice and a positive approach to climate change, not relying on things like a lockdown to reduce our emissions. That's my short answer. Well, maybe not so short.
Dr. Nebo, your thoughts?
Thank you. Before we run out of time, I want to say that what I've heard our panelists talk about is deeply, deeply impressive. And I feel like a slight bit of an imposter here, trying to give you my opinion. But I do want to say something because of my age. You guys are young, and despite everything I would like to say about it, I'm not. I'm turning 56. I protest about it every day, but that's how it is. I still feel like I'm 19. And really what struck me about what you guys have been saying, which is so deeply important and interesting, and I feel so empowered by the fact that people like you are our present and our future, and that we're in good hands with you guys. But there is something I wanted to add, and that's the perspective of history. And while you were just talking in the last 5 minutes, I jotted down something. I jotted down a list of events. And the reason I want to point this out is because the crisis we are facing today, namely the COVID crisis, the climate crisis, the George Floyd precipitated events, none of them are coincidental from each other. They're all happening together for a reason. And to be young and with a future which concerns you as much as it should, today, this is front and center for you. You have to deal with these issues. But I want you to imagine what it was like to be young in the following eras, in the 1600s to the 1800s, when with European expansion around the globe, in the periods of slavery, where people were literally taken from their homes in West Africa and East Africa and taken across the world to South America, to North America, and to Europe. Slavery was part of our history. And the link between what happened then and what's happening today in America with Black Americans is real. It's a real link. There's a proper link between those two events. The First World War, which was effectively, and the Second World War, which were effectively Northern Hemisphere wars, were events where people's homes were bombed. There were planes flying over, bombs dropped on their houses. Cities were devastated, that we know. There was the famous epidemic of the Spanish flu, so to speak. Now we can talk about that now. If it wasn't for COVID, I wouldn't have remembered that. But up to 500 million people died from that. Imagine being young in those days, right? I've got another long list which I'm going to quickly run through, but there was the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Vietnam War important because it created the power of youth in the youth revolution against the war in the United States. African independence, colonialism and independence, globalization, the 2008 recession, where many of you were younger then, but you will remember it. And then and I can go on and on about these big events, which were all crises at the time. And why I'm raising all of this is because it's something that I think Alex said earlier, is about what business as usual is, and how deep do we want to cut if we want to change things in the future. Because we have systems of governance, we have systems of capital, we have these fundamentals which have become normal to us, right? And if you read that book by Yuval Harari, who talks, it's a very difficult book to read, but there's certainly sections in it where all the assumptions we make about how society works, all those assumptions are really just agreements. There's nothing natural about capitalism more natural about socialism, more natural about having authoritative governments which we elect. In the United States, governors can decide whether there's a lockdown or not the central government, right? Why shouldn't that work for us, for example? So I'm going to stop now. All I wanted to say was that it's fascinating, but don't lose sight of history, because there's so much to learn about what's happening today in historical events, if we can just try and identify them. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neville. In terms, while we're on the topic of history, one thing that is very part of South African history is energy. And I don't think we can talk about how South Africa will get into a new normal without touching on this topic of energy. And for that, I'm going to pose it to Alex. So my question with regards to energy is that I read on the internet a while back, there was this talk of this new green new. So can Alex, that's part of it. Can you touch on the green new situation? And also my question is, I know that ESCOM is an issue, electricity is an issue. If you've never suffered load shedding, you are not a South African. And my thing is, my question is, what is the best, this most sustainable and the most attainable transition method for South Africa to look at, to ensure that 20, 50, 100 years from now, that our country is in a secure, okay place in terms of renewable power economy? Yes.
Thank you, Tiamo. So let's start with the Green New stuff. So there's a lot of talk about Green New Deal and all that. And basically this has come out initially from the US context. It's based on the idea of the New Deal under Roosevelt, where basically they came out of deep economic recession and the government put in place this really robust program to rebuild, restructure their society, to put people to work. And so that was one of the really big ways that they came out of deep recession. There was all sorts of problems with it. It was a very racist deal in terms of it benefited white people most and so on. And so there's that problematic history. But the Green New Deal is different because it is about incorporating environmental justice into it. It's about incorporating racial justice into this vision, and economic justice and social justice and access to healthcare as part of this broad transformative vision. And it's about putting in place this new vision of the role of government and this major transformative and radical program to rebuild society. So that's where that Green New Deal discourse comes from. And it connects to energy because energy is central to especially the climate problem, with fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas being responsible for about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions around there. And it's clear that, I mean, South African government's own research modeling shows that renewable energy, solar, wind, hydro to a certain extent, battery storage, even tidal, but mostly solar and wind, are the best technologies. They're the cheapest, most affordable, most job creating. The problem is politics, really. The technologies are mostly there. And even Sasol could become a producer of renewable hydrogen if it invested properly in the research and development of those technologies to help run vehicles, to help run hydrogen and gas plants as backup to renewables. So we can do it, but it's about the political will. In the integrated resource plan, which governs our energy future in South Africa, they put an artificial limit on renewable energy because of politics. And they said, we're going to cap how much renewable energy we can have, even though we shouldn't, because renewable energy is our best energy future, right? And the key to unlocking that is a just transition, is ensuring that we can protect workers and ensuring that we can put in place this transition in a way that is beneficial to all. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to let you know that we are running a little over time. So, but I'm still going to take about 2 more questions from everybody that's been joining us. Our next question, it is from a fast member. The name is Romnye Karan. It says, during the pandemic, we've seen many changes in ways in which we purchase and consume goods. There's definitely been an increase towards supporting local businesses and supporting our local economies. Going forward, how can we maintain this notion of supporting more local brands? We know that most of the time, local can be expensive, and most of us cannot really afford the South African products as compared to the Chinese product. So then how do we reach a balance between supporting local at the same time affording local, affording local, as well as reducing purchases on imported products? That's an open one for everybody. But before this question is answered, I just want to let everybody know that all the questions that we didn't manage to get through, they will all be answered on our Facebook. So don't worry, you'll still get your answers. So our panel can it's an open question to our panelists, that one.
Okay, I can give it a shot. I think, but just before I get to that question, I did want to say that, one of the things I've been going back to a lot of the work that Naomi Klein has done, especially around this concept that she has of disaster capitalism. And it's really the idea that, especially in moments of crisis, governments often exploit those moments to introduce new forms of being in society post the crisis. So I think a lot of the times when we think about disaster capitalism, it's often phrased in very negative terms. And I do think for us as well, which links to this question around how do we use this moment to support more local businesses, to bring in a new society that thrives. And I think, I don't know if I would actually even agree with the starting premise that through this crisis, we've been able to support and buy local. I think there are some sectors that have thrived, but I think when you think about local economies, you think about the taxi services, you think about the street vendors. One of my MA students, Tulani Siziba, wrote a paper on township businesses that actually have not been able to thrive under COVID-19. So I do think for sure there are sectors that might have thrived, but I think for the most part, actually, we haven't been really able to integrate, especially the informal economy into this COVID world. So my starting premise would really be that actually we have to start thinking about, in the case in which we have another crisis like this, how do we ensure that those industries that are so central, especially to the Black population of South Africa, and haven't been able to thrive? I read something, in Joburg, there's a huge conversation now because taxis, because of social distancing prescriptions, have actually had to raise up the fares so high. And so how do we think about also then supporting those in the informal sector and so on? So I do agree with, of course, buying local, but I actually think this moment has shown the ways in which we actually don't actually support local business, especially the ones that are not formalized and are in the informal economy. There was, just before I know we're running out of time, there was an interesting, beautiful, the latest Destiny magazine cover, and it shows this photo of this Black woman who went viral, and the police are literally moving her away from her stall. And she's talking about how, if you don't allow me to sell, what are my children going to eat? So you can see as well there the interlinkages between these structural systems that only recognize the formal economy and really in many ways ignore those women who might be selling veggies on the streets and so on. So I do think we have to think more around what we mean when we talk about local business in our context. But I'll respond more on the Facebook group because I don't want to take too much time.
Yes, thank you so much, Kobane. Yes, definitely. This conversation was started here, but it's not going to end here. I encourage everybody to have continue this conversation on Facebook and have a conversation with your family members, your friends, because yes, it started here, but I think if we talk about it, that's when we can find better ways of actually solving it. And as we said, it's not just a governmental issue, this is civil. And I think everybody me, you can do something, and making sure that our South Africa, in terms of a new normal, is better than the old normal that we have had before. With that being said, I would like to thank the Director of Access, Dr. Neville, for being an amazing host and for allowing us this platform to share, for my panelists to share their ideas and to share their thoughts of the lockdown, COVID, and how South Africa can move forward. So thank you very much to my panelists, Alex, Mendy, and Tobani. Thank you so much. And to everybody that attended and watched, thank you too. That's it for us. Enjoy the rest of the day. Stay safe. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Well done.
Yeah.